I'm Lex Harris. I'm the managing editor of CNN Money, and I'm here today with Austan Goolsbee. He's the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. That makes him the White House top economist. For the past few days on CNN Money, we've been collecting our readers' questions on the economy and a wide range of money issues, and we're going to get a chance today for the next half hour to pose them directly to Mr. Goolsbee. It should come as no surprise that the number one topic on people's minds was jobs. They also talked a lot about America's debt crisis, housing, and a lot of other stuff. We will take readers' questions live as well, and I would like to note that while we are at the White House and with White House cameras, all of the questions were vetted by CNN Money editors. So with that, let's start with jobs. And it's really I want to start with what came across as the most direct and straightforward question. It comes from Glenn Myers, and it's, what are you doing specifically to create jobs, and when do you expect these jobs to materialize?
Well, I'm chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for coming, and thanks, everybody, for taking the time to watch. The CEA is kind of an internal think tank in the government, so I personally have seen to hiring of CEA staff, but that, that's the extent of my personal job creation lately. I think the focus of the economic team at the behest of the president is, what policies can we design that will facilitate helping the private sector stand up to create jobs? Because the president's view was from the beginning, and continues to be now, that private sector job creation is the sustainable form, and that's where we ought to be pointing the aim. So I think what the government's doing specifically is trying to get the private sector to invest, to hire, and things like that.
And so, just to Glenn's question, so specifically, what policies are we talking about that will encourage that private sector?
Okay, so the president's obviously put in place numerous infrastructure investment ideas. The HIRE Act that the president passed gave tax incentives for companies to hire people that had been unemployed for a certain amount of time. He's cut taxes 16 times for small business and passed the Small Business Act, which gives credit to small businesses and cuts the capital gains rate to 0, for example, for anybody starting their own business or investing in a small business. I think those are productive areas. And then you've seen the president's newer initiatives, because he's the first to say it's not enough, we got to get the growth rate up more, have centered on tax incentives for companies to do their investment here at home. So either incentives for them to build factories and buy equipment in the U.S., incentives for them to do their research and development in the U.S., as well as some more proposals to rebuild our highways, rebuild our airports here in the U.S.
Do you think, are those policies which have already been announced, and are they already baked in, do you think, to the unemployment forecasts that we've seen for 2011, many at 9%, certainly most more than 8%?
Some of them. I mean, the last three policies are things the president proposed in the last few months on a bipartisan type of basis. I wouldn't think anything like that is in the forecast. Usually in the official forecast, they take the policy as the policy baseline of what's in the budget or what's expected to be there.
Sticking with jobs, just because it was such a big part of the questions we received at CNN Money, one thing that came up a lot was about protecting American jobs. Donald Lee, there were many of them. One letter from Donald Lee came in, and it was, what are you doing to stop foreign IT workers from taking American jobs? And when will you do something about offshoring American jobs?
Well, I'd say, clearly the U.S. is now operating in a global economy. The downturn was a global downturn, and now you've seen some countries coming back faster than other countries. I think the president's been highly concerned that we correct those aspects of the tax code that, for whatever for whatever the baseline fundamentals are, there are things in the tax code that specifically give incentives for companies to move their operations, to move their profits, and to move their workers out of the U.S. And the president said categorically, we ought to end those and use that money to provide direct incentives for them to locate the activities in the U.S. I noted that GE recently announced they were bringing back some appliance factories from abroad, moving them back to the U.S. because I don't exactly know the combination of reasons, but the productivity remains extremely high. U.S. has the most productive workers in the world. I think the specific answer to the question is most of that centers on tax policy, both the carrot and stick. So with the stick side, let's end these incentives to move operations out of the U.S., and let's use the carrot side to encourage the investments here at home.
And is that something on the table or just policy that he's for?
Some of those were enacted. Some of those he's for, and more than just being for them, put them in his budget and is called for, and they've come up. Now, the CA is not especially political office, so I don't want to get into the so much of the back and forth in Congress. But I will note that the president has sponsored numerous tax bills to try to end tax havens, to try to reduce the amount of shifting, the incentives for shifting your operations out of the U.S., and a lot of those have been held up, and they shouldn't be.
One more on jobs. It sums up from Paul Oman, it sums up a view you hear so often. Why did the president choose to work on healthcare first rather than creating jobs?
Well, look, within 30 days of coming into office, the president passed the Recovery Act and has been absolutely nonstop focused on the issue of economic growth and job creation ever since. That doesn't mean that should be to the exclusion of everything else. And the crisis of the healthcare system was something that he campaigned on, was quite important, and we had to do to address the squeeze on the middle class in this country that was long-standing. You know, the previous 8 years had squeezed the middle class like never before, followed by worse recessions since 1929. I disagree with the premise that he prioritized healthcare above jobs. That's not true. And I can give you a long list of major policies, as well as I said, more proposals that the president says we've got to do on that.
Let me ask, so setting aside the long-term benefits of healthcare and the need to do it, would you accept, what do you think of the argument that healthcare reform, just the uncertainty that it created, is it by itself restricting job creation?
I don't put a lot of weight on that. I know there are some sectors or industries who raise that, but I would note, look, there was a contentious healthcare debate. The bill was passed several months ago, so whatever uncertainties alleged from that, most of those uncertainties got resolved, you know, when the bill was passed, whether you were for it or not for it. I think by far the biggest uncertainty in the world of business that is preventing investment is uncertainty about what will be the level of demand. And you see that on a global basis across really all the rich countries of the world, but you see that in the U.S., and that's why the president's out there every day trying to get the growth rate up and trying to get the job engine going.
I want to move to the nation's debt levels. This comes from Stefan, and the question is, the federal debt is forecast to hit $15 trillion by 2015, and the ratio of debt to GDP is forecasted at 100% by 2020. When will this become a real problem, and what can be done about it?
Okay, I think Stefan raises an important point and identifies, and I like that he identified, the proper way to think about debt in the country is as a share of your GDP. The U.S. starts from a relatively low level of debt to GDP compared with other developed countries. It is quite obvious that the most important thing that has led to large short-run deficits is we are coming out of the worst recession since 1929. when you go into economic downturns, historically as well as across countries, it's perfectly obvious that you get lower tax revenue, higher automatic stabilizer spending, and so you tend to have big deficits in a period like that. That is why before the president ever even sets foot in office, the CBO has already projected that the first year deficit is going to be $1.3 trillion, the biggest we've ever had, because the economic downturn is as bad as anything in our lifetimes. What we need to do, that's the short run matter. And in the short run, when you're just coming out of the worst downturn since 1929, that is not the time to try to tighten the belt in the immediate term. You would run a great risk of repeating one of the mistakes of the Depression and sending us back into double dip. Medium and long run fiscal consolidation is obviously necessary. The president set up a bipartisan fiscal commission to report in December on ideas of how we could close the longer run fiscal gap in a bipartisan way, because his view is that can't be done one party versus the other party. The system just won't allow it. I think we will have to confront the long run fiscal issues centering around the aging of the population and the acceleration of healthcare costs, which we have known about for decades, and those two things have not deteriorated in the last 2 years. They have been long-standing issues, and I think that's where you got to start for the long-run debt.
Now, what's so interesting about his question is he did ask, at what level does it become a problem? So in other words, we're kind of getting lucky right now that markets haven't rebelled against it, and we've been able to keep borrowing. A lot of budget experts say that could turn pretty quickly.
I don't know that I agree with that. The markets, as I say, the U.S. starts from a lower debt to GDP ratio than most of the rest of the developed world. And so when you go through an emergency crisis like this, or as World War II, a similar thing, we have had periods where our debt to GDP ratio got up substantially higher. If you start from a low base, you can manage to do that, and certainly thus far, the markets do not appear to think that the U.S. is in some crisis. We have record low interest rates and extremely low long-run interest rates. If people thought this was a long-run problem, you would have expected long-run rates to have risen significantly, and they have not.
Do you think if the president's fiscal commission, when it comes out with its recommendations on December 1st, if action isn't taken on it, do you think then that would send the wrong message?
I don't know. It's a bit of there are two layers of hypothetical in that. I will say the president wanted, and it would have been better if it was literally a base closing commission style group where whatever they came out with, Congress was required to vote on it. Now, if you remember, it would have passed, but there was a group of senators who sponsored the bill, and then when it looked like it would pass, they changed their vote and voted against their own bill. That is water under the bridge. The way it is set up now, I know the president takes it very seriously. Whatever they come up with on a bipartisan basis will be very important to the president. He wants to see what people can agree on, because he's not afraid to say we need to confront these longer run fiscal challenges facing the country. But I just want to emphasize again, it is really important that we not conflate and confuse the deficits of the last 2 years, which are virtually 100% due to the deterioration of the economy, with the longer run fiscal challenges facing the country, which we have known about for 25 years and we must address, but addressing those is totally different than let's go through and try to cut this or that program.
We are taking questions live as well, and this one is on housing, which was another big theme in the questions we've been collecting. It comes from Missy Bird, and the question is, what bailout, if any, are you imposing for people who are in foreclosure in Florida?
Well, look, Missy's, if Missy is in Florida, which I assume from the question, everybody in Florida knows it's been massively hard hit by both the economic downturn and by the housing downturn. It was a place of dramatic housing expansion, and they've had high unemployment and high foreclosures there. There is not a specific bailout in the sense of the question. The president has outlined a series of housing policies meant to address to help stabilize the housing market and to address the issue of people losing their homes who, if they had an affordable, if they had a payment level that was affordable, they could stay in the home through it. And we can go into detail in what some of those programs are, but there are ways to get the monthly payment down without dramatic bailouts. He's also got a hard-hit state program that's really relying more on giving incentives to states to come up with creative solutions at their state levels to deal with the downturn in house prices. The good news, I'd say, in this, of course, is relative because the housing market's been hard hit. But a year and a half to 2 years ago, people thought prices would fall substantially more than they have. And the free fall in house prices appears to have stopped, stabilized, and if anything, there are a few series where there have been some modest increases in house prices. That's certainly the first step. I think plowing through the excess buildup of housing and the vacant homes remains one of the headwinds that we're pushing up against.
I want to move to, a lot of people actually had some really interesting, very specific policy prescriptions that they wanted to run by you. One came from Rajesh Shah. Well, actually two proposals. And it was, is there any reason not to restart two rebate problems that he says really worked? The home purchase rebate and the car purchase rebate.
I guess I would say, so there was what's known in the parlance as the Cash for Clunkers program,
Right.
where they bought up old cars. If you bought a car that improved the gas mileage by a sufficient amount, you could get a credit for turning in your old car. And the first home buyer's tax credit. I would say these were done at a time we were trying to shift demand into a period to stop free fall of the private sector economy. I think it's a tough slog out, but we are not in free fall in the way we were when the president came into office and in those first 5 or 6 months. I think you always want to be as stimulative as possible. You don't want to get yourself on a situation where you keep shifting things forward and then you can't afford not to extend those. But it's certainly worth considering if in either the autos or the housing market you see conditions like the ones that were in place when we passed those policies. If you see those conditions again, we ought to always keep our eye on these.
So you would say they were successful at the time for jump-starting demand, but you wouldn't, but that it comes with a cost?
I mean, look, there's a cost to every policy. Right. They obviously cost money, and they were about this shifting. They're very different, obviously, first-time homebuyer tax credit and the Cash for Clunkers, but they're in this style of argument as that, and that remains in the toolkit. I think the president's view has been what we need now is more along the lines of targeted jobs programs or things about business investment in this country, making this an attractive place to invest in factories and equipment. So consumer autos, consumer housing aren't in that group, but they remain in the toolkit, things like that.
So onto financial markets. Paul Petrevius asks, have you considered the fact that massive amounts of credit expansion brought on by the Federal Reserve through low interest rates cause asset bubbles that ultimately have to pop?
Yes, I don't see how anybody can look at the experience of the 2000s and the popping of the housing bubble and not think about it. That said, we're coming out of the deepest downturn since 1929. And I'm not going to comment on the conduct of monetary policy. That's obviously Ben Bernanke's job, and the Fed is independent. But I will say I do think that the standards of what's the proper monetary policy and how easy credit should be clearly ought to be influenced by how the economy is doing. And if you're trying to get out of a very deep downturn, you certainly take actions that are not the kinds of actions you take at a time of great booms or higher interest rate environments.
So understanding that you don't want to comment on Federal Reserve policy, if another bubble pops, it will very quickly become the administration's problem, everybody's problem. So, I mean, is it something, how risky is it?
I couldn't tell from this question, is that to the view that this is creating an asset bubble.
In bonds,
where?
commodities. I assume he's speaking about a lot of different areas.
I mean, the credit policy, we're in what the economists call a liquidity trap, where the interest rate is extremely low, and the role of fiscal policy and targeted job creation is important. So I guess I would put the focus there. I'm not going to comment on what Ben Bernanke has done or ought to be doing. It seems like that's a dangerous area for me.
I understand. Here's one from that we're taking live right now. It's a little bit off topic, but I hear about it so often. It comes from Matthew, and it says, notable economists are on the record supporting the legalization of marijuana. Where do you stand on the issue? We had another one from the
That's my concerns are making the U.S. an attractive place for capital investment, to create jobs, making us as competitive as we can possibly be. The CEA, under my leadership, has not engaged in any studies of the legalization of marijuana, and I am not a marijuana smoker, and so that's not my.
On the record.
That's
okay,
not
fair enough. I will say the one who wrote into CNN Money with it had the happiest Facebook photo I'd seen. But anyway.
You cannot get on Facebook at the White House. It's a government rule, so I'm going to trust you on that.
Fair enough. We got so many questions on student loans as well. This one is from Brenda Goldfuss, and she writes, my daughter just graduated college in the top 1% of her class. She got scholarships, grants, she did everything right. But she can't find a job. Her student loans are coming due in a few months, and I can't see how she can start paying them off. What can you do to help her?
I mean, it's awful. Stories like that are terrible. They are a reflection of what happens when you're in deep recessions like the Depression or like the one we've just gone through, is that the job market has been impaired. We've had dramatic improvement in the job market from January 2009, but it's still a very long way from recovered, and the unemployment rate to be high. I mean, I think the first thing you do is every possible thing you can to get the economic growth rate up and to get the job market engine restarted in the private sector where the job creation would be sustainable. And as I've said here and many other places, I think there's a pretty aggressive agenda the president has outlined that would help on that. On student loans themselves, I would also highlight, as part of the Recovery Act, the president put in place cut taxes for some 100 to 150 million people, more than $100 billion of tax relief. And several pieces of it were directed at expanding tuition tax credits, expanding student loans, and trying to make education more affordable, because it's clear that over the medium and long run, getting skills and training is going to be extremely important for keeping our workforce competitive. So I have terrible sympathy in circumstances like this, but I think the federal government, all we can do is try to do every possible thing we can to get the private sector fully stood up and the job engine back working.
Okay. Another very specific policy question came from Lisa, who asked, is there any consideration being given to suspending tax penalties for being forced by unemployment to withdraw retirement funds? She continues, those of us who have been laid off and are in our mid-50s are having a great difficulty finding work. We are really struggling, and the penalties are truly punitive.
That's an interesting question, and I will have our people look into that. Some retirement accounts allow borrowing against your account in various cases and for various uses, and you still have to put the money back in. I would highlight, we don't want to create a second crisis of retirement. You know, we know that people's IRAs and 401ks were hard hit in the economic crisis, so that a lot of people have been feeling insecure about their retirement and trying to rebuild their balance sheet, if you want to call it that, for their retirement. But I think this is worthy of looking into, of specific rules on IRAs for people whose retirement accounts don't allow them to borrow money against them. I will take a look at that.
Okay. So much in recent days on the dollar and currency markets, in recent months really. And Matt Crichton asks just a simple question. Can the downward spiral of the dollar be stopped, or is it inevitable?
Well, look,
I don't know how simple
as
that
you
is.
know, the Treasury is the
Sure.
official government spokesperson on dollar policy, so I'm not going to comment on that. I believe that the president has been pretty clear that on the issue of China currency versus the dollar, that he would like exchange rates to be more market determined and less politically determined, and that he hadn't felt that China had gone far enough yet on that side. But you know, we know for years, for most of the last 8 years, we've had major international imbalances in the U.S. on the trade deficit and in other countries. And so, you know, I think a lot of the movements here are largely market determined, and you know, as long as that's happening in a reasonable time frame, it seems reasonable.
Okay, I think we are ready for the last question. And I did want to note one interesting thing: of more than 100 questions we got, not one mention of the Bush tax cuts, which I found very interesting.
That is interesting.
So the last question, this was from Jeff, and I couldn't tell if he was being funny or not, but I thought it raised an interesting question. Mr. Goolsbee, I've spent $35,000 this past year from my savings, buying TVs, appliances, taking vacations, and remodeling my kitchen, all in an effort to do my part to keep the economy going. I'm pretty much tapped out now. What more can ordinary citizens do other than try to be good consumers to boost the economy? And the reason I asked it was I thought maybe he was getting at the issue between spending versus repairing household balance sheets. But
well, look, that's quite a TV if he's got $35,000. But I will say this.
Yeah.
Part of the struggle that we are in, and why it takes a while to get out of this, is, number one, it was extremely deep, and everyone knows that. But number two, if you look at the boom that we had over the 2000s, it was driven by residential real estate construction, really reflecting a housing price bubble, and then consumption growth that was faster than income growth, which was obviously not sustainable, where people were spending beyond their means on an extended basis. So now we must recover, but those two pillars that were the last boom are not available to us, and we've got to have a different style of recovery. Now, the president's identified that would be business investment driven, factories and equipment, that we have a focus on exports, that we try to get credit to small business, that those kind of three on the business side, and that if you look at households, the savings rate has come back from literally negative. All the private savings by people in the United States added up to less than nothing at several points in the 2000s, has come back to 5 or 6%, which is a fairly high number in recent history. Consumption growth can be a driver of recovery, but we want it to be a consumption growth that is proportional to income growth, so that it's a sustainable consumption growth. So the 35,000 that, was it Michael? That Michael said he... that Jeff spent on TVs and others. I hope that's a sign that Jeff's income is high enough to sustain that. It would be both presumptuous and probably wrong to be encouraging people to just go out and spend beyond their means. That doesn't make sense. That's got us into trouble before. But the rebuilding of balance sheets with higher savings, coupled with consumption growth that's proportional to income growth, and of emphasis on getting businesses to invest in this country and to export things that are made here to other countries, I think is a model of the kind of sustainable business cycle that the president would like to get us to. I think that is a bipartisan issue. I think people of both parties in business and labor and ordinary citizens recognize we've got to be competitive and growing to maintain our standard of living and to remain really the richest major economy in the world, which is what we have been, the most productive. And I think we're going to do that. We just got to get out of this short run hole, but I think the long run prospects are quite good.
Okay, that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.